The FJ-2 and 3 Furies are probably the perfect case example of how a single bright idea can ruin an aircraft. In this case, the aircraft in question was the F-86 Sabre. The bright idea was in some ways a sign of things to come. Intended to help pilots hit their targets in a dogfight, it ended up making the Fury so useless that the Navy's only option was to give it to the Marines. And things had started out so well. Realizing that their straight-winged fighters were outclassed by the MiG-15, the Navy had also realized that although the Korean War meant it would be difficult to start new fighter projects, it very much enabled them to modify existing aircraft for a new mission. Propelled by this newfound parsimony, the Navy and North American Aviation proposed a navalized version of the then new F-86 Sabre. This initial version needed to keep changes to a minimum so that it could reach the fleet as fast as possible. Design started on the 29th of May 1951. The first order of the day was to make adjustments for carrier suitability. Instinctively, you might think that low-speed control was going to be a problem because of the swept wing. The Navy was led to believe that it would actually be okay. Their test pilots determined that the F-86A actually had a lower stall speed than the F-9 F-5 Panther that represented the cutting edge of Navy service fighters at the time. Lower stall speed doesn't necessarily translate into ease of control at low speeds, but we'll get to that in a bit. Adaptation started with takeoff. First, catapult attachment bridles were needed as there was no way a Sabre was taking off under its own power. In order to get the Sabre into the right attitude to fly once it had been accelerated by the catapult to the deck edge, a taller, tougher front landing gear strut was fitted. The forward landing gear door moved from a hinged two-piece to a single-piece unit. For landing, a deployable V-frame arrestor hook was attached to the rear fuselage. Carrier trials would lead to the landing gear track being widened by 8 inches on production aircraft to increase directional stability. A barrier guard, barrier pickup, and retractable tail bumper that moved with the landing gear were also fitted. The other big departure from the Air Force Sabre related to tactical doctrine. Whereas the Air Force was still more or less happy with rapid firing and reliable 50 caliber machine guns, the Navy had moved almost wholesale to 20mm cannons in 1945 and 46. So before the Air Force launched their own Sabre cannon experiments in Gunval, the Navy specified their new Fury with 4 20mm Mark 12 cannons with 180 rounds per gun. The M12 was a decent, but not an amazing weapon. Based on the Second World War Hispano-Suiza aircraft cannon, it used a relatively light shell to achieve a high muzzle velocity of 3,300 feet per second and a decent fire rate of 1,000 rounds a minute. It was not, however, an especially reliable weapon and had a reputation for jams that stuck with it through to the Crusader, which I believe was the last new fighter to be armed with it, if we're not counting the first Corsair IIs. The installation is quite interesting. Rather than put the guns one above the other, as on the Gunval Sabres and the later Sabre Hog, the Fury has the guns in the same vertical plane, one in front of the other. Moving to the M12 increased the weight of the guns in the installation from 372 pounds to 405, but the light cartridge of the Navy 20x110 round meant that the all-up weight of the installation was basically the same. The Navy had previously tested similar setups very extensively and concluded that the 20mm was about 3 times as effective as 50 cal. The Fury's battery was therefore judged to be twice as effective as that on the Sabre from a weight of fire perspective. Otherwise, we're looking at an aircraft somewhere between a -E and a -F Sabre. There was a small aerodynamic change from it. The tailplane dihedral was eliminated so that they no longer matched the angle of the wings. The canopy is also different. The bottom of the canopy frame curves down towards the front so that the canopy can roll down rails into the closed position. The Sabre canopy rail is straight as it was generally closed before takeoff. The Fury had a 6,000-pound Force J47 variant, 800 pounds more powerful than that on the F-86E. It had the all-flying tail and the APG-30 radar gun sight, although with the Navy's Mark 16 Mod 2 sight in place of the Air Force's Sperry A1CM. When the final modifications for carrier use, including the hydraulically folding wings and modified canopy, were added, the Fury was about 1,000 pounds heavier than the F-86F. Empty weight was 11,800 pounds, F-86E weighed 10,555, takeoff weight was 18,800 versus 17,800, about 5% heavier. With the pressing need for faster fighters, the Navy ordered 200 before the first prototype had even flown. Carrier testing was carried out between October and December of 1952 using the Midway and Coral Sea as they had the largest decks. Low-speed handling of the jet was not as good as the Navy had anticipated. The strengthened landing gear still wasn't strong enough, and the arrestor hook wasn't sufficiently damped. It tended to jump over the wires on landing. Test pilots quickly concluded that the Fury just wasn't suitable for fleet deployment. None of the problems were truly insurmountable, but armament testing had demonstrated that there wasn't any great point in taking the FJ-2 Fury to sea. There were two problems with the FJ-2's cannon setup. One was solvable and one was not. The Fury didn't suffer from the gun gas ingestion issues that plagued many contemporary fighters, but the first issue testing identified with the weapon system instead related to shell ejection. The initial design simply ejected shell casings out of the gun bay and into the airstream. This led to a cascade of casings smashing into the wing and tail surfaces. Although not a risk to the aircraft, the Sabre's wing was very carefully designed to optimize airflow. Dents were not conducive to that fine performance being retained. North American therefore redesigned the lower fuselage to include a collector for the shell casings. Testing resumed, demonstrating that gun gas buildup in the container was manageable and the issue was therefore judged solved. So now we can come to the brilliant idea that the project officer in the Bureau of Aeronautics had when specifying the Fury. In basically every jet fighter, the aiming point of the guns is straight down the roll axis of the aircraft. As the pilot starts to pull Gs to track a target, the aim point drops further and further below the roll axis. This is all perfectly natural, and pilots learned how to adjust their aim point, aided by gun sight adjustments. In the Fury, the guns were physically installed in the fuselage so that their aim point would be directly down the roll axis of the aircraft when the fighter was pulling 3 Gs at 500 knots and with a 50% fuel load. Careful analysis had revealed that all engagements result in these kind of shots, thus saving countless hours of pilot training and increasing the Fury's MiG-killing potential. Now, it was also true that in the unlikely situation that a pilot found himself not in a 3G turn at 500 knots with 50% remaining fuel, aiming would become rather more challenging. The aim point not only fell away far below the roll axis, it also moved in a way only predictable if you were able to do the mathematics of a rotating body instantly in your head based on limited data. Remarkably, the Bureau didn't accept that their innovation was not only less than genius, but in fact a major problem, even as the initial reports from the test pilots came in. The Navy pilots therefore devised a regime of shooting at banner targets to demonstrate their point. The results of this were unequivocal. Essentially, the Fury was an impossibly bad gun platform at anything other than close range. Inside of 600 feet, it was bad but manageable. A pilot who achieved 60% accuracy in a Panther would score 40% from this range with the Fury. Beyond those ranges, it was just spray and pray. The Bureau admitted that things weren't great. Unfortunately, they had by this point ordered the initial 300 FJ-2s. Luckily, they had already had the foresight to reduce this to 200. Sadly, that was because they had also ordered 538 uprated FJ-3s in April 1952. The issue was structural. Changing the angle of the guns would require a complete redesign of the front fuselage structural members and paying for new tooling. It just wasn't worth it, even if it did leave them with 750 severely compromised aircraft. Oops. The Corps received all of the FJ-2 Furies on the basis that they weren't suitable for carrier use. As this photo demonstrates, they could not only go aboard ship, but on occasion they actually did so. This is a 1955 photo from a med cruise on the Midway. Cannon issues aside, the Fury was pretty popular in the Marines. Although not as hot as the Sabre, it was a significant performance upgrade over the F9 F2 Panther. Fun and easy to fly, the only major issues they encountered were with the hydraulic flight control system and the engines. The flight control system on the Fury and the F-86E were both irreversible systems. The pilot had no direct mechanical connection to the control surfaces. Maintenance of the hydraulic system was therefore essential. Any contaminants in the hydraulic fluid and the system would lock up, depriving the pilot of control. The engine issues related to the attachment points of the turbine blades onto the axle. As delivered, they had a propensity to fly off. New, stronger attachment points solved this. Tactically, the Dash 2's lack of range was a major problem. The amount of internal fuel carried was basically enough to take off, climb to 40,000 feet, turn around, and return to base. Drop tanks were a must, but that meant that no other external stores could be carried. All they would have were the cannons, and I've covered that problem already. With tanks, ferry range was 800 to 900 miles. There was no provision at this point for aerial refueling. Before the gun issues came to light, the main issue that the Navy and the Bureau had with the Fury related to its thrust to weight. There were also aerodynamic improvements to be made, both to incorporate ideas from the Air Force Sabre program and to address low-speed handling. The 5th production FJ-2 was therefore fitted with a Wright J65 Sapphire engine, producing 7,700 pounds of thrust. As with many Navy engines of the day, this was a licensed British-built engine, in this case the Armstrong-Siddeley Sapphire. Remarkably, this modified aircraft was the only prototype for a fighter that the Navy was going to buy in significant numbers. They would ultimately receive 538 in 2 batches. The FJ-3 looked like the FJ-2 for the most part, with the exception of a 3-inch deeper air intake to supply the increased airflow needed by the more powerful engine. It's worth saying that although people get misty-eyed about the Arenda in the Canadian Mark VI, the Sapphire was actually more powerful. Early FJ-3s had the same slatted wing as the FJ-2, but this was quickly changed for the classic 6.3 wing that deleted the slats and extended both the root and tip for improved high-altitude maneuverability. The leading edge droops more than on Air Force Sabres to give some of the low-speed control advantages of the slats. Another side benefit was creating an additional 124 gallons of additional fuel tank space in the wings, usefully extending range. 6.3 wing Furies also benefited from a removable refueling probe that, when fitted, was mounted under the left wing and extended well forward of the leading edge. To cope with transonic handling issues encountered in testing, a wing fence was fitted just outside of the wing fold line to break up airflow along the wing. About halfway through production, an additional 2 pylons were fitted under the wings, for a total of 6. 1,000-pound bombs or clusters of rockets could be carried on them. Given the ongoing cannon issues, these formed the primary offensive armament in a ground attack role. The last 80 FJ-3s were designated FJ-3M, and they were wired for AIM-9B sidewinders. 2 could be carried on the inboard pylons and were the main armament on air superiority and interception missions. In a way, the Fury reminds me of the later MiG-21 F-13, a poor gun platform that essentially had to rely on its new and finicky missiles for its primary armament. The Fury was a fast fighter for its day, capable of 690 miles an hour in combat condition. Sea level rate of climb was 9,400 feet per minute, although at takeoff weight it was more like 6,750. Combat ceiling was 47,000 feet. Essentially, this was an F-25 Sabre in performance terms, but with greater ground-to-air potential and very little chance of hitting anything with its powerful cannon armament. As a point of trivia, the easiest way of telling a hard-wing FJ-3 from its predecessors is actually the paint job. The original Furies were painted glossy dark blue. Hardwing FJ-3s and onwards were painted two-tone gull grey over white. The first Dash 3 came off the production line in December 1953, but deliveries were slow. By the summer of 1954, only 24 had been delivered, just about sufficient for fleet introduction activities to begin. This was nearly 18 months after the service introduction of F-9 F-6 Cougars. VF-173 Jesters was the first squadron to start working up with the slatted wing Furies, beginning in September 1954. They had some experience with swept-wing operations in the Cougar earlier in 54, so presumably understood the basic principles of operation. VF-173's first cruise was on the Bennington in May 1955. Bennington had just received her SCB-125 modification, giving her an angled deck in addition to the previously installed hydraulic catapults, and making her a good base for the Navy's hottest fighter. The first FJ-3Ms went aboard Bonhomme Richard in August 1956 with VF-211 fighting checkmates. 19 Navy and 4 Marine squadrons would ultimately be equipped with FJ-3s, which alongside the Grumman Cougar formed the backbone of carrier air wings in the middle 1950s. If you like your trivia, an FJ-3 was the first aircraft to land on a supercarrier, when one set down on Forrestal during its working up trials. It didn't last long in service, however. From 1958, the supersonic Tiger and Crusader began to rapidly supplant it in the front line, and the FJ-3 went to the reserves. It existed at a time of rapid change on Navy carrier decks. The Fury had initially been brought aboard as a high-performance interceptor with a secondary strike role. The Fury was 50 miles an hour faster than the Cougar and could climb about 6,000 feet higher. Climb rate was 50% or so better. Both could carry Sidewinder in their later incarnations. In making this comparison, I'm obviously overlooking the fact that the Fury was a poor gun platform in comparison to the Cougar. As is so often the case, the trade-off for performance was range. Whereas the Fury was restricted to 1.5-hour mission durations on internal fuel and 2 tanks, the Cougar could last 3 hours. Both types could employ in-flight refueling from the carrier's Savages, but you can see how the more pedestrian Cougar offered more utility as a combat air patrol and as a strike aircraft. For this reason, carrier air wings more often than not had 2 Cougar squadrons to 1 of Furies. Even so, both lasted about the same time in frontline service, and they were phased out together in favour of supersonic aircraft. So despite its serious flaws as a weapons system, the Fury gave good service in a rare period of peace for the US Navy. Moreover, its great acrobatic potential and forgiving handling was a welcome introduction to swept-wing aviation for a service that had been trapped in the slow lane for the better part of a decade. The Fury's story with the Navy did not end with the slimline FJ-2 and 3. Its final iteration would also be North American Aviation's final Navy fighter. But that is the subject for another video.